I am Jared Stamm, editor with NYVT Media. I am joined by Caton Deuso and Doug Rocque, both reporters with the Granville Sentinel and the Whitehall Times. And we're talking today with Matt Castelli, who's candidate for representative, U.S. Representative 21st District, and is running against incumbent Elise Stefanik. And we're going to sit down this afternoon and just have a conversation about the issues and about your candidacy. So if you would start, Matt, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Perfect. Thank you, Jared. And thank you, Caton and Doug. So I'm Matt Castelli, running for Congress here in the 21st Congressional District, born and raised in upstate New York, in a bipartisan household. Dad's the Democrat, mom's the Republican. And so maybe it's not much of a surprise that for much of my life, I was an independent. I went to Siena College, and while I was there, 9/11 happened, and that became a driving force for my career. I went and I joined the CIA, served there for nearly 15 years, leading teams hunting down some of the world's most dangerous terrorists. I worked in the same department that found Osama bin Laden. I served in Afghanistan and Iraq, and had enough success doing all of that I was tapped by the Obama White House to come down and serve as the Director for Counterterrorism at the National Security Council, a role I was asked by the Trump administration to stay on in, and I did. Because when it comes to our safety, security, and strength, it means putting country before party. And my belief in that has never wavered. Now, I went back to CIA, did some work with cutting edge technology startups, got a business degree out at Northwestern, and then COVID hit. When I come from down in the Hudson Valley, my grandfather he was an Army doctor at West Point. It's not too far away from West Point. And my grandfather remained a physician after he got out of the Army, and he raised a family of nurses. Almost every single person in my family is a nurse, with the exception of my mother. She served in a different way. She became a teacher. But my grandfather instilled within our family a sense of duty, a duty to care. And so when we got to this point pretty quickly in the pandemic, where we're having a 9/11 every single day in this country, it was the most compelling challenge of our time. So I left government and I joined a healthcare organization here in New York, started by a couple of veterans to better coordinate care for veterans, rural communities, connecting health and social care together. Really transformational work. I loved what I was doing. But then January 6th happened. As you might imagine, a former counterterrorism guy who spent a career trying to prevent things like that from happening in foreign capitals, to see it happen in our own didn't sit well with me. But what really didn't sit well with me was the response and actions in the run-up to that day by Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, who I believe sold out our country. I think she sold out our democracy in her support of what was, in my view, a violent insurrection to overthrow our government and to overturn the will of the people. And so not too long after that, we decided to launch this campaign. And we've been excited about the coalition that we're building, not just of Democrats, but independents and Republicans as well. I'm running not just on the Democratic Party line, but on the moderate party line. Because when I hear from folks all throughout the 15 counties that make up New York 21, it's a big district, been driving all throughout, folks are concerned about Congresswoman Stefanik just being a little too focused on her career advancement and not focused on our future. She sold us out in many regards. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that. But they're looking for a moderate, somebody who can bring us together to actually start solving problems, not creating them. And so that's what we're focused on here in this campaign, not just to win an election, but bringing people together to actually govern better and more effectively.
Thank you. Doug, you want to start?
Sure. Matt, unfortunately, all too frequently, we're seeing many incidents of mass shootings across the country. And crime in general has been on a dramatic increase, not only here in New York State, but across most of the country. Why do you think that is? What can we do about it?
Well, there are a couple of things I think to do about it. Certainly crime has been on the rise. I think here in New York, there are real challenges in terms of bail reform and how that's been mismanaged by Albany lawmakers, the governor, and what I hear from our criminal justice system, whether that's law enforcement or folks in the district attorney's office or judges, is that they need a greater degree of judicial discretion by which to keep our community safe from violent criminals and offenders. And so I think that there's work to be done there. I think that we need an opportunity to actually start making the investments that are necessary to create communities that can thrive. That's around investment in education and healthcare and mental health and behavioral health and substance abuse. Those are the kinds of investments that we need in our communities so that they can thrive on a whole host of fronts, but also pay dividends in terms of the reduction of crime. And so there are opportunities there. You did highlight the rising rates of gun violence that we do have across the nation. It's important to note that gun violence is the #1 cause of death of our children in this nation. And this is a compelling challenge. It's one that requires our degree of urgency and real commitment, certainly by lawmakers at all levels of government, to actually address the challenges facing our kids in our communities, because we all want to keep our kids safe. Now, I'm a gun owner myself. I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment. I swore an oath to the Constitution. So it's not going anywhere, the Second Amendment, certainly under my watch. But we need to recognize that there is a challenge that we need to address, this rising rates of gun violence. And how do we do so? I think we do so with a coalition of us who are gun owners, support the Second Amendment, and want to seek common sense solutions to keep our kids and communities safe. You do so with universal background checks. You do so with red flag opportunities to empower our law enforcement. Our law enforcement want the tools. If they identify someone who's a threat to themselves or to others in our community, they want to prevent them from having access to the firearms to do harm on a mass scale. And so I think that there are common sense solutions that those of us who support the Second Amendment, are gun owners, and want to keep our kids and communities safe can bring to bear to actually achieve the objective here.
Thank you.
Okay. Here I go. Most polls say that the economy is really of utmost concern to voters this year. Inflation's at a 40-year high. Shelves are still bare because of supply chain issues. I may have noticed that trying to buy vegetables, did some frozen vegetables last night. What does the country have to do to fix this?
Yeah, it's a compelling challenge, and it's a top one that I hear as we travel all throughout the district and meet directly with voters. And there are 15 counties. I've been relentless. We've been having town halls and meet and greets and roundtables, and this is one of the top issues that we hear from. It's about the rising costs of daily life for working families and seniors. And so it's the top issue that I'm going to fight for and to address in Washington. There are a lot of things to be done. And in each area where we talk about these things that are affecting folks, it's some combination, right? It's about the cost and lack of availability around childcare or affordable housing or healthcare and prescription drugs or groceries in the grocery store or our fuel prices. Each one of those things has different solutions that need to be brought to bear, because this is, as you rightly noted, a supply chain issue. It's a supply side issue. What has caused many of these increases in prices is this serious imbalance of supply and demand. We have strong demand for many of these things, but the supply side was cratered and devastated during the pandemic and hasn't bounced back. When we talk about purchasing certain goods and services that require a component that's made in Asia, well, those supply chains were broken and haven't restored. And so those goods and services now are at a high price. When we want to talk about actual fuel prices and the impact that something like the war in Ukraine has in, our supply chain there, or the implications for OPEC rising, cutting production, that has serious implications as well. We want to talk about, food supply and creating a scenario where we're building resiliency in our community by having a start and a finish in places like Washington County, where we can create resiliency for our food supply. There are a lot of different initiatives that can be brought to bear for the different areas that we have challenges for many working families. We just need somebody that's interested in actually solving the problem. And right now, unfortunately, I don't believe we have a representative that is. I think she's misidentified the problem, probably to pursue a political objective. But the challenge there is that she's allowing American pain to be a political opportunity. And that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for problem solvers. We're looking for folks that can bring to bear solutions to actually reduce the costs of daily living for working families.
Okay, thank you. Great. Caton, go ahead.
The U.S. Supreme Court decision to repeal Roe versus Wade has again made abortion, and in particular women's reproductive rights, a hot button issue. And what are your feelings about the decision, in particular, the district, as it's not necessarily a state issue as it's written into state constitution?
So it's a serious issue for millions of American women across this nation right now who are directly under threat, having had their rights stripped away from them to control their own bodies and make their own healthcare decisions. That was the immediate impact of overturning Roe. The future impact, though, is one that we're starting to see clear indications of, where you have folks like Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, who is now the highest ranking member of the Republican Party in the House of Representatives, who is co-sponsored and pledging to advance a national ban on abortion that would directly threaten women here in New York, despite some protections that we may have in law at the state level. And so this is a real challenge and a real threat to millions of American women, to include the ones we know and love here in this state. And it requires addressing. It requires, I believe, federal legislation to codify the protections that were contained in Roe into federal law, to protect not just women here in New York, but millions of American women across this nation.
And it's been speculated that the Democratic Party remains in control of the House Senate. They will produce legislation to make abortion a national right. Do you favor that?
Yes, I do. I certainly do, because this is about a question of whether women should be in control of their own bodies and healthcare decisions without interference from the government. Government has no role to overreach into exam rooms or into a woman's life in the way that it is now being allowed to do in states all across this nation, and in which some members of a political party that my opponent, Elise Stefanik, seems to continue to espouse these designs in which government can somehow overreach in such an egregious way. It's a violation of a right. It's a violation, I believe, of the constitutional right to privacy, and women should be empowered to make those decisions for themselves with no interference from the government.
Matt, we've been talking about abortion, but let's delve into healthcare in general. Many Democrats, well, at least some anyway, have supported some form of universal healthcare. Now, Obamacare took a step in that direction, but do you think the country should adapt a more nationally funded and controlled healthcare system, as perhaps is seen in some European countries and to an extent in Canada?
I won't go as far as to say universal. What I will say that I would support the creation of is a public health option, or a public option, something that would allow greater degree of competition in the broader insurance marketplace by affording folks universal coverage, by making sure that people aren't dropping off the rolls just because they lost a job. We want to make sure that folks have health insurance, and I think a public option is a good idea by which to create the sense of security that comes from knowing that if you get sick, you're not going to go bankrupt by addressing that, or knowing that you can show up in a healthcare environment and be able to address your needs. We want to make sure that that is something that we have available to folks. So I won't go as far as to advocate for a universal sort of Medicare for all, one single payer model, in large part because people like, in some instances, the healthcare that they have. Some members of unions, some of which have supported our campaign, their unions fought very, very hard for the healthcare coverage that they have, and they may very much like it. We want to make sure that they're able to keep that. So I don't want to deprive anybody from the health insurance that they like, but we want to make sure that we're expanding coverage in such a way that creates additional space and security for folks that currently don't have coverage, and to make it a little bit more affordable. And I believe a public health option like that would create greater affordability all across the marketplace.
This public health option, would it involve current insurance companies that offer health care in some form?
And we have different examples of that, in which Medicare Advantage, for example, in some instances is being provided by a private insurer, but using government funding in order to do that. I think public-private partnerships are a great idea on many challenges that we face in this nation, because you're able to bring to bear the social need and the social drive to provide for a social requirement, but use private sector ingenuity. And in many instances, we get a greater efficiency and ingenuity that comes from the private sector. And so I reject sort of the notion that some folks have, it's either an all government solution or a no government solution. Sometimes it's both. And our opportunity to advance public-private partnerships, I think, are great scenarios by which to effectively affect people's lives and produce stronger outcomes.
Thank you.
Heading in a different direction now into the Russian-Ukrainian war. How would you rate our response to that, and what as a country should we be doing? Is there more or less we can be doing?
Yeah, good question. And I've been critical of the Biden administration on other foreign policy issues, to include the withdrawal from Afghanistan, because, true to form, country before party, I'm going to call out members of my own party when it's necessary and appropriate. But in this regard, I'll give the Biden administration a lot of credit. They did a masterful job in leveraging intelligence information from my former colleagues at the CIA and across the intelligence community to forecast Vladimir Putin's intentions in a place like Ukraine, to then rally together NATO and European allies to understand the real threat in advance of the invasion, and then to maybe even make some of that information public to prevent Putin from having this, false notion of legitimacy for expansionism, which is what he really sought. And so the greatest weapon we now have on the battlefield in Ukraine is the low morale of Russian troops. And it was that work that this administration did that created that scenario. In addition to that, we've done a tremendous job of providing both lethal and humanitarian aid to allow Ukraine to be in the strong position that they are right now. I think it's safe to say here on October 20th that Ukraine is winning this conflict. And not many folks thought that that would be the case early on in the conflict. And that's a tremendous testament to the bravery and courage of the Ukrainian people, strong leadership that they've had from President Vladimir Zelensky, but also the strong support that they have received from the United States, as well as our international partners, our NATO allies, and European partners in pursuit of this. I think we should continue support for Ukraine. I think we need to monitor what is currently being expended, because I believe that the number right now is about $40 billion have been approved. We want to make sure that those resources are being used effectively. And I hear the concern from many folks who are maybe, and I think rightfully, we're spending $40 billion to protect Ukraine's borders, but what are we spending on our own? And that is a valid concern, and it's one that needs to be addressed. But Ukraine is a fellow democracy, a partner in the world, and we deserve to support them in their effort here and to continue to do so. And so I'm committed to doing that. I am concerned, however, that in the Republican caucus that Congresswoman Stefanik oversees, that we've seen this support for Vladimir Putin and an undermining of their commitment to NATO. Some people have referred to this as the Putin caucus. I think that that's very dangerous, and I think it's incumbent upon senior leaders within the Republican Party to stamp that out, because it is very dangerous for America, our partners and allies across the world, and certainly dangerous for Ukraine right now.
And a little further along with that too, the war has had a big economic effect on the U.S., particularly with regard to wheat and energy. Is there anything we can do to mitigate that?
Well, certainly we touched on this a little bit in terms of our own food supplies to create resiliency within our own nation. And that's true across the board for any number of things that we rely on. We want to have resiliency in our supply chain. We want to make sure that our supply chain that is critical begins and ends here in the United States. And so focus and attention should be placed on that for any number of food sources that we otherwise are looking at for overseas. And I think there are tremendous opportunities in our own district to make sure we're making investments and supporting small family farms to be able to make the locally grown food that we all rely on. In terms of fuel prices, this is a key challenge. This actually dates all the way back. If you actually look at the pandemic, and in 2020, former President Trump coordinated with Vladimir Putin and OPEC, Saudi Arabia, to cut oil production. They did this during the pandemic because we saw demand crater because people stopped driving around, they stopped using energy. And so in order to boost oil prices for both oil companies as well as nations like Saudi Arabia and Russia, they cut production. They had a big agreement to do so, I think by some double-digit figure in terms of millions of barrels a day. Production has never really come back, and it certainly hasn't come back to meet the strong demand that has resurged in the aftermath of the pandemic. We've seen not just nations like who are part of OPEC Plus, but also big oil companies make a conscious decision to keep production at artificially low levels because they don't want to be subject to the boom and bust of demand that may crater due to a pandemic or an international conflict. They want to keep those prices high. They've kept them artificially high, and I think we're all paying the pain and the price for all of that at the pump. Certainly I am, as I drive about 60,000 miles right now across this district in this campaign in my truck, and I pay for that out of my own pocket. So there's a real challenge there. And in order to protect against for those international swings of a globally sort of determined commodity, which oil is, we need to create some resiliency here at home by, yes, boosting short-term domestic oil production, but that's still an internationally determined price. The best way to really reduce prices is through competition and diversifying our energy sector. And that's by making the long-term investment that we have refused to make for many decades, but hopefully we're in a position to do so now by really investing in alternative sources of energy, renewables in particular, to create competition in our energy sector to reduce the costs of fossil fuels that we're now all dealing with as a result of the war in Ukraine and the pandemic.
Thanks. Thank you.
So the first thing President Biden did when he took office was cancel the Keystone XL pipeline. Critics say that under the Trump administration that the country was self-sufficient on energy, but because of the pipeline cancellation and other decisions by Congress and the president, um, we are once again dependent on other countries for energy, in particular oil. I know we just touched a base on oil and specifically with the Ukraine war, but do you agree with this contention at all?
It's actually a little bit of a myth that has been promoted by many folks. I'm going to put a little bit of business school hat on here when we talk about these issues, because the Keystone Pipeline exists. It was never shut down. It's currently flowing. Oil is coming from Canada and it's flowing through the United States. What was canceled was an extension of that pipeline. That extension was never operational. And currently the supply that's flowing through the Keystone Pipeline, it has extra capacity right now. And I've tried to liken this as the analogy of, think about a soft drink. Right now, we've got a large size soft drink, and what's flowing through the pipeline is a medium in terms of volume. So there's extra capacity that exists within the existing soft drink cup size. XL was to supersize it. And so we canceled the supersize because we didn't need it. And it had other sort of natural challenges in terms of tribal lands, as I understand, and eminent domain and other challenges that were going to be happening there. There is some legitimacy to the argument, however, about do we have an opportunity to increase domestic production? And what can be brought to bear to encourage the big oil companies to increase production right now? What I've heard and seen is that Wall Street shareholders are determining, because they want to keep the price of oil high, that they don't want those oil companies to increase production. And so there is a consideration and concern about whether there are enough sort of leases and land availability to continue to drill and create extra production. This administration is saying that there are. Big oil is saying we're going to keep production at the levels that we're at. And I think it is totally appropriate to expect more, as I do, of this administration to boost short-term production. Bring big oil down to the Rose Garden or the South Lawn of the White House and have a forum and start talking about what are they going to do to increase production to alleviate the pain at the pump right now. But America technically is still energy independent. We produce more domestically than we consume. That is the classic definition of energy independence. That doesn't help us with the prices that we're paying at the pump, because the price for oil is determined on the global marketplace. It is about the volume that's available across the different supply and demand calculations we have right there. The best way to make sure that we're not subject to those international whims is by having diversification of our energy sector and having alternatives to reduce the price of oil and at the gas pump.
And following up to that, what, if any, changes in our energy policies, if there are any, what would you like to see?
Yeah, I mean, I think very much along the lines with what I was just discussing in terms of bringing pressure to bear against big oil companies to increase production and to stop gouging. They're certainly raking in record profits right now. We're paying so much at the pump. They're bringing in record profits. Their Wall Street investors are happy with that scenario, but the American people are not. And we need to bring pressure to bear and attention on that phenomenon. That's something that we can do on an immediate basis. I think we also need to bring to bear pressure from the bully pulpit of the White House or from Congress to make sure that oil companies are increasing production during this short-term time frame, but also making the longer-term investments that we need to diversify our energy sector. And that's through solar, wind, hydroelectric power. In some instances, depending on the environment and what they want to do, nuclear. All options should be on the table about how we generate energy in this nation and be able to diversify ourselves away from such an exclusive reliance on fossil fuels.
Excuse me. You've spoken both pro and negative about some things on the Biden administration. What do you think of his performance to date in office?
Listen, I think I can empathize with some of the challenges that they were handed. They were handed a terrible surrender deal by the Trump and Pompeo administration, committing to a surrender and withdrawal from Afghanistan. But they own the conduct of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. The Biden administration does. They were handed a terrible scenario with a pandemic that was raging. And I think they weren't in a position to anticipate multiple variants popping up that created challenges. But they've done a good job of managing our way out of the pandemic consuming all of American life. I think we're transitioning, knock on wood, out of the way of the pandemic with COVID. And so I think there's some credit there. I've been critical of them on managing inflation. I think that they and the Fed were too slow to realize that this was not transitory, that this was a compelling challenge, and they could have put in place some monetary actions, certainly through the Fed, sooner rather than later. So I think overall it's a mixed bag. I'd like to see some greater strength out of the president and this administration on the economy, because the top challenge that I hear from folks is really about the rising cost of daily life. And we need to be able to make sure that we're addressing those challenges.
21st district has undergone a number of geographic changes with redistricting, and some say that with its enrollment and voting record, particularly with the addition of Rensselaer and Schoharie counties, the rural parts of those, it's become slightly more red. Do you agree? Does this make your challenge, your campaign, even more difficult, more challenging?
No, I actually think it becomes much more competitive. Listen, the areas that have been added to the district, particularly Rensselaer County, portions of Montgomery, Schoharie, and even Otsego, were most recently part of New York 19. And that was a district that Antonio Delgado, now Lieutenant Governor, flipped from red to blue. And very recently in a special election, my friend Pat Ryan, who's now Congressman Pat Ryan, because he won that special election, despite on election day, I think there was a poll that said he was down by 8 points. And so I think that these are areas where you find an opportunity for folks to come together as throughout the rest of New York 21. Folks don't view themselves, I think, through red and blue. Folks view themselves as members of our community, as neighbors, as friends who want to come together and solve problems. I think this is a moderate district that has voted for President Obama twice. It voted for people like Bill Owens, who was a moderate Democrat. Heck, they even voted for Elise Stefanik when they thought she was a moderate. And her pivot to the far right is way out of step with the values of our community, with this now promotion that she's had of really extreme policies and hateful rhetoric that seek only to divide and create sort of revenge politics that does no good in serving the American people and the many challenges that we're facing. And so our opportunity here is to build a moderate coalition. I'm not just running as a Democrat, I'm running as the moderate party candidate. Another line on the ballot from which to build a strong coalition of not just Democrats, but independents and Republicans. Because I hear from Republicans all the time, Republicans are concerned about the far right, the ultra MAGA wing that Congresswoman Stefanik leads and how it doesn't represent their Republican Party. People like my mom say that to me all the time, and they feel a sense of political homelessness. We're creating a campaign that's not about Republicans versus Democrats. It's about all of us seeking a public servant that's actually going to focus on our future rather than right now a self-interested sellout who's focused on advancing her own career. That's what this race is really all about. It's not about party lines or partisanship. And so we're building that strong coalition from the middle out and giving a voice to the great moderate majority that right now feels not just a sense of homelessness, but that they don't have a voice. The loudest voices in the room right now that are dominating our television screens and our social media are on the extremes, with Congresswoman Stefanik on that far right extreme and dominating that voice there. And people really want to restore a voice for the great moderate majority where we can actually start coming together and solving problems.
Caton, I'm going to jump in here for just a minute with a follow-up on that. 40 years as a reporter covering politics, and I do not recall in that career such divisiveness and acrimoniousness on both sides toward each other.
Yeah.
The gap seems to be as wide as the Mississippi River instead of what it was many years ago, a narrow stream where the best of the country was the main focus. Now it seems to be politics is the main focus. How do we get by that? How do we bring this back to the country? Yeah, people are going to have different versions, but how do we get away from all this divisiveness and get the focus back on the country?
It may be one of the most compelling challenges of our time, and certainly right now. We certainly saw that manifested on days like January 6th, and in the aftermath, those who are willing to defend a violent insurrection to overthrow our government. Our Constitution and our democracy should come first, always, and we should seek to protect those things. And it's not encouraging to see folks stand up and offer a strong voice in support of the Constitution, like Congresswoman Liz Cheney, and to be cast out by her party as a result of that. We need to make sure that we're creating a space to identify what unites us. And what unites us is our Constitution. What unites us is being Americans, not Republicans, not being Democrats. Those things don't come first. being an American comes first. And that's what our race is really all about. And I think we have an opportunity here in this race and in this district to set a tone for the rest of the country. This is a front line in the battle for the soul of America, because we saw our incumbent Congresswoman make such a very strong shift from once being a moderate who claimed to be bipartisan, and to throw all of that aside in order to seek advancement of her own career and the power of her own party at the expense of our country, at the expense of coming together, at the expense of bipartisanship. And I think it's turned a lot of people off, certainly in our community. We have this opportunity here from the middle out to build that coalition that showcases we can come back to being Americans first. We can show the rest of the nation an opportunity by which to showcase what it means to be an American, what it means to be focused on advancing our needs as a country. Because when I talk to folks, that great moderate majority that doesn't have a voice right now, there isn't a lot of daylight between the things that are issues for them. You know, rising gas prices or inability to find childcare, those issues don't care whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. And the solutions shouldn't be determined by whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. It's a problem. We solve problems by coming together. We might offer different perspectives about how to do that, but our focus to include as voters should be expecting our elected representatives to offer real results to the challenges in front of us, not to evaluate people based upon how good of a Republican they are in fighting with Democrats, or how good of a Democrat they are in fighting with Republicans. That's what's gotten us into trouble in the past. And there are a lot of other, malactors who are involved in that, whether that's cable news or social media that foment those echo chambers and those divisiveness because they've got a profit model that benefits from that. And we should certainly always be watchful of those in power who are seeking to divide us in order to retain power. I think we need to elevate those voices of moderation, those voices that are moderate, that can unite us and bring us together. And that's what we're looking to do in this campaign.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And you've spoken a little bit already about the red wave and kind of just the amount of Republican body that there is. But I was wondering, even if just one house of Congress switches, will there be a gridlock in Washington at all?
We're starting to see what the Republican majority might look like. And Congresswoman Stefanik and her close allies in leadership are already forecasting that it's not going to be about reducing inflation. It's not going to be about making a stronger economy. They're going to be bringing forward investigations. It's going to be about revenge politics. Stefanik very recently pledged that she was going to impeach the president of the United States and allow Marjorie Taylor Greene to be one of the strongest voices in Congress of a Republican majority. I don't think that what that looks like about 2 years of gridlock, because they're not going to focus on actually addressing the many challenges and problems that we have here. So that's the real risk at stake here. But I think we have an opportunity in this race to remove one of those voices who would be leading, I think, the Republican Party down a very dangerous and dark path. The many Republicans I talk to don't want to see revenge politics dominate Washington, D.C. They don't want to see gridlock. They want to see solutions. They want to see problem solving. And to see Congresswoman Stefanik really forecast what her leadership would look like, I think we have an opportunity to set the tone and remove that from Washington, D.C.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Before we leave this phone call, I want to get a screenshot because I always forget to do that. So I'll do that right now. Okay. Is that all right? Or just everyone smile? Yeah, good. Okay, thank you very much. Is there anything else you want to tell us or discuss? Anything we haven't covered that you think is important for the voters to know before the election?
Well, this is certainly one of the most important elections of our lifetime because there is so much on the line. There's so much at stake, certainly for our community and for our country. And voters should know that I'm always going to fight for them. I'm always going to put them first. Our priorities are derived from what I've heard from folks as we've traveled throughout the 15 counties that make up this district. I'm always going to show up to listen to them, to hear them, to elevate their concerns. I'm going to be a fighter to reduce costs for working families and seniors and make sure that we can build a strong economy that works for everyone. I'm going to fight to defend our freedoms, a woman's right to choose and to control her own body, and the Second Amendment. I'm going to fight to ensure that we've got safety and security for everyone. And that's going to be about fully funding our law enforcement, securing our borders, but it's also going to be about protecting our democracy and making sure that folks have the kind of security that comes from having access to Social Security and Medicare and healthcare resources in their community and good paying jobs. So those are our focus areas in this campaign and what we take forward back down to Washington, D.C. The American people have already placed their trust in me once before to protect them from terrorism. And the voters of New York 21 know and can trust that I will always have their backs, that I will always put them and their families first. And I'd be asking for their vote on November 8th.
Anything from anybody else? That seems pretty good to me. Thank you so much
No,
for taking the time.
Thank you, Matt. They very, very pointed and full of subjective material answers to the questions. I appreciate that.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Doug.
Have a good rest of your day and good luck.
Thanks all. Appreciate the opportunity.
Stay warm up off Lake Ontario.
Well, bye-bye.